The moment arrives unannounced, like a fracture in the foundation of a building one assumed permanent. A person looks into the mirror and confronts a stranger wearing their face. The career that once defined them feels like borrowed clothing. The relationships that anchored their sense of self have dissolved or transformed beyond recognition. The beliefs they inherited from family, culture, and circumstance no longer resonate with the frequency of their inner experience. This is not depression, though depression may accompany it. This is not merely a crisis, though crisis is its messenger. This is the call, the summons that the alchemists knew well, the initial spark that ignites the great work. The ancient practitioners of alchemy understood something that modern psychology has only recently begun to articulate. Identity is not discovered, it is forged. The medieval texts speak of Prima Materia, the formless base matter from which the philosopher's stone must be created. But the truly initiated recognized that this Prima Materia was never lead or mercury. It was the practitioner themselves, stripped of all false accretions, reduced to essence. The moment of breakdown is simultaneously the moment of breakthrough, the necessary dissolution before reconstruction can begin. This initial spark carries with it a peculiar terror. The ego, that construct of stories and social mirrors we mistake for our authentic self, recognizes the threat to its existence. It responds with what the mystics called the dark night, a defensive contraction, a desperate attempt to maintain coherence. Yet something deeper than ego has awakened. The psyche, in its wisdom, has recognized that the current configuration no longer serves growth. The vessel has become too small for the expanding consciousness it contains. What appears as destruction is actually a summons to creation, an invitation to participate consciously in what was previously an unconscious process of becoming. The question that burns at this threshold is deceptively simple. Who am I when all the definitions fall away? Who remains when the titles, roles, achievements, and relationships that comprised my identity are stripped like paint from wood? The alchemists would answer, this is precisely the right question, and it can only be answered through the work itself. Philosophy offers no consolation here, only a map. The territory must be traversed in solitude, in silence, in the laboratory of lived experience. The reconstruction of identity demands first a philosophical foundation, an understanding of what identity actually is and is not. The Hermetic Tradition offers a framework that modern existentialism has echoed. Identity is not essence but process, not substance but relation, not fixed but dynamic. This understanding liberates the seeker from the tyranny of authenticity as a hidden treasure waiting to be discovered. There is no true self buried beneath socialization, waiting to be excavated. There is only the self you are creating moment by moment through choice, attention, and will. Carl Jung approached this truth through his concept of individuation, the process by which a person becomes psychologically individual, that is, a separate, indivisible unity or whole. But Jung, steeped as he was in alchemical symbolism, understood that wholeness does not mean completeness. The self is not a finished product, but an ongoing synthesis, a dynamic equilibrium between conscious and unconscious, between persona and shadow, between the individual and the collective. The goal is not to achieve a static state of self-knowledge, but to establish a relationship with the self-generating process that we are. The alchemical doctrine central to identity reconstruction rests on three pillars, corresponding to the traditional tria prima of alchemy: sulfur, mercury, and salt. Sulfur represents the animating principle, the will, the intentional fire that drives transformation. Without will, conscious, directed, sustained, nothing changes. The person remains trapped in reactive patterns, buffeted by circumstance and conditioning. Mercury represents fluidity, adaptability, the capacity to dissolve fixed forms and move between states. This is psychological flexibility, the ability to hold multiple perspectives, to question assumptions, to entertain paradox without collapsing into confusion. Salt represents structure, the crystallizing principle that gives form to possibility. This is discipline, practice, the repetitive actions that embed new patterns into the nervous system and psyche. The doctrine teaches that identity reconstruction requires the integration of all three principles in proper proportion. Will without flexibility produces rigidity and fanaticism. Flexibility without will produces diffusion and paralysis. Structure without the animating fire of will and the adaptability of Mercury produces empty ritual, form without content. The alchemist must become intimate with these three principles within themselves, learning to activate each as circumstances require, developing what the Hermetic tradition called the art of combination. But there is a deeper layer to this doctrine, one that the surface reading of alchemical texts obscures. The true architect of identity is not the ego, not the conscious mind with its plans and preferences. The true architect is what Jung called the self, the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, personal and transpersonal. The ego's role is not to design the new identity, but to cooperate with the design that emerges from depths it cannot fully comprehend. This is the paradox at the heart of the work. One must engage with total commitment and intention while simultaneously practicing surrender to a process larger than conscious understanding. The Hermetic maxim, as above so below, applies here with particular force. The microcosm of individual identity reflects the macrocosm of universal process. The same principles that govern the formation of stars, the evolution of species, and the unfolding of history govern the reconstruction of self. There is pattern, there is rhythm, there is an intelligence inherent in the process itself. The seeker's task is not to impose arbitrary form on the chaos of possibility, but to discern the pattern trying to emerge and align their will with its realization. This requires a fundamental shift in relationship to oneself. The Western tradition, particularly since Descartes, has taught us to relate to ourselves as subject relating to object, an I that observes and controls, a me. The Hermetic tradition suggests a different model, the self as ecosystem, a complex adaptive system in which multiple processes interact, compete, cooperate, and evolve. Identity is not something you have, but something you are participating in, a conversation between multiple aspects of being that the conscious mind can influence, but never fully control. The doctrine demands humility. It demands the recognition that much of what drives behavior, shapes preference, and colors perception operates below the threshold of awareness. The unconscious is not an enemy to be conquered, but a partner to be engaged, a source of wisdom that speaks in symbols, symptoms, and synchronicities. The alchemist learns to read these messages, to interpret the dreams, the slips of tongue, the irrational attractions and aversions that map the contours of the unknown self. Finally, the doctrine insists on the primacy of experience over theory. One can read every alchemical text, memorize every psychological concept, understand intellectually the entire process of transformation, and remain utterly unchanged. Knowledge must be metabolized, integrated through practice, verified through lived experience. The laboratory is not the library, but life itself, particularly those areas of life where resistance, fear, and discomfort arise. These are the sites of potential transformation, the raw material waiting to be worked. The reconstruction of identity follows a discernible pattern, a sequence of stages that the alchemical tradition encoded in the operations of the great work. While individual journeys vary in detail, the underlying structure remains consistent, appearing across cultures and centuries with remarkable regularity. This is not because humans are following a script, but because transformation follows natural law, as consistent as the metamorphosis of caterpillar to butterfly. The Nigredo, dissolution and descent. The journey begins in darkness. The alchemists called this stage Nigredo, the blackening, and depicted it with images of putrefaction, death, and decay. Psychologically, this is the phase of breakdown, when the old identity structure collapses under the weight of its own inadequacy. The persona, that carefully constructed interface between inner self and outer world, reveals its artificiality. The stories one has told about who they are lose their power to convince. Shame emerges as the gap between ideal self and actual behavior becomes undeniable. This stage is characterized by confusion, grief, and often a profound sense of meaninglessness. The coordinates that once oriented existence have vanished. The goals that motivated action feel hollow. The relationships that provided validation may dissolve or transform, exposing dependencies that masqueraded as love. This is not comfortable. The temptation to abort the process, to rush toward a new identity as escape from the discomfort of no identity, becomes intense. But the Hermetic teaching is clear. Dissolution must be complete before reconstruction can begin. Partial dissolution produces partial transformation, leaving fragments of the old structure to contaminate the new. The seeker must descend into what Jung called the confrontation with the shadow, all the denied, repressed, and disowned aspects of self, the parts of personality deemed unacceptable by family, culture, or self-image, must be acknowledged, examined, and ultimately integrated. This stage demands radical honesty, a willingness to see oneself without the softening filters of ego defense. It requires solitude, not as escape, but as container. The alchemists worked in sealed vessels, and the seeker must create psychological enclosure. Boundaries that protect the vulnerable process of dissolution from premature exposure or interference. This is why authentic transformation often requires temporary withdrawal from ordinary social engagement, a sabbatical from the performance of normal identity. The Albedo, Purification and Clarification. From the depths of Nigredo emerges the first light, Albedo, the whitening. This stage is characterized by increasing clarity, discrimination, and the beginning of separation. What was confused and conflated begins to differentiate. The seeker starts to distinguish between authentic desire and conditioned wanting, between values genuinely held and values imported uncritically from others, between personality traits that serve growth and defensive patterns that inhibit it. The primary work of Albedo is purification through analysis. One examines the components of the dissolved identity with discernment. Which elements deserve to be carried forward into the new configuration? Which must be released? This requires the development of what the philosophical tradition calls phronesis, practical wisdom, the capacity to make sound judgments in particular circumstances without the security of universal rules. Here the seeker often engages in structured practices of self-examination, journaling, meditation, therapy, or spiritual direction. The unconscious material that emerged chaotically during Nigredo is now subjected to conscious reflection. Dreams are recorded and analyzed. Behavioral patterns are traced to their origins in early experience. The stories that have governed one's life are deconstructed, examined for their truth value, and either revised or discarded. Albedo brings relief after the darkness of Nigredo, but it carries its own dangers. The primary risk is premature crystallization, the rush to establish a new identity before the work is complete. The ego, uncomfortable with prolonged uncertainty, may seize upon a new set of ideas, a spiritual system, or a psychological framework, and construct a new persona as rigid as the old. The seeker trades one form of identification for another without achieving genuine transformation. The Hermetic tradition warns against this through the symbol of the white peacock, whose display of beauty is spectacular but ultimately empty, form without substance. True albedo is not about constructing a new self-image, but about developing the capacity to observe oneself with clarity and compassion, to hold the complexity of one's nature, without collapsing into simple narratives of good and bad, success and failure. The Citrinitas, solar awakening and conscious will. The third stage, sometimes called Citrinitas or the yellowing, represents the dawn of solar consciousness, the activation of conscious, directed will in service of transformation. If Nigredo is lunar, receptive, dissolving, feminine in the Hermetic sense, and albedo is mercurial, discriminating, analytical, androgynous, Citrinitas is solar, active, generative, masculine in the Hermetic sense. This is the phase where intention crystallizes into action. The seeker moves from self-examination to self-direction, from understanding to implementation. The insights gained during albedo are now tested in the laboratory of daily life. New patterns of thought and behavior are practiced deliberately, repeatedly, until they begin to feel natural. This requires tremendous discipline and what the Stoics called ascesis, spiritual exercise, the systematic training of attention and will. The danger of Citrinitas is inflation, the ego's tendency to identify with the power of conscious will and believe itself master of the transformation process. The seeker may become grandiose, convinced they have achieved enlightenment or mastery, when they have merely learned to manipulate surface behavior without addressing deeper structural issues. The antidote is continued humility, the recognition that conscious will is necessary but not sufficient, that one is participating in a process larger than ego can comprehend. This stage also involves what Jung called active imagination, the practice of conscious dialogue with unconscious contents. The seeker learns to engage with inner figures, to negotiate with resistances, to honor the wisdom of the body and the emotions while not being tyrannized by them. Identity reconstruction is not about the triumph of reason over feeling, consciousness over unconsciousness, but about establishing right relationship between these polarities. The Rubedo, integration and incarnation. The final stage, Rubedo or reddening, represents the integration of all previous work into a new, stable yet dynamic configuration. This is the chemical wedding of alchemical symbolism, the union of opposites into a higher synthesis. The new identity that emerges is not simply a rearrangement of old elements, but a genuine emergent property, something that could not have been predicted from the starting materials. Rubedo is characterized by a sense of groundedness, authenticity, and purpose. The person knows who they are not through abstract self-concept, but through embodied presence. There is alignment between values and action, between inner experience and outer expression. The performative aspect of identity, which can never be entirely eliminated in social existence, is now consciously chosen rather than unconsciously compelled. Importantly, the identity forged through this process is not rigid, but resilient. It possesses what the Hermetic Tradition called flexibility and firmness, strong enough to maintain coherence under pressure, flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances without fragmenting. The person has internalized the process of transformation itself, recognizing that identity is not a destination, but a journey, not a state, but a practice. The Rubedo stage manifests practically as the capacity to live from authentic purpose, to engage relationships without losing oneself, to contribute meaningfully to the world beyond the boundaries of personal concern. The energy previously consumed by internal conflict, by the maintenance of false persona, by the suppression of shadow material, is now available for creative engagement with life. Yet even Rubedo is not final. The alchemical tradition speaks of the multiplication of the stone, the understanding that transformation is not a linear process completed once, but a spiral that returns to similar challenges at deeper levels. Each cycle of dissolution, purification, conscious work and integration prepares the ground for further transformation. The reconstructed identity becomes the base material for the next stage of development. No journey of identity reconstruction proceeds without crisis. There comes a moment, usually deep in the Nigredo or at the threshold of Rubedo, when the entire enterprise appears futile. The seeker confronts not merely psychological discomfort, but existential despair, the terrifying recognition that there may be no inherent meaning, no essential self, nothing but the void beneath the constructions of language and culture. This is what the mystics called the dark night of the soul, though that term has been diluted through casual use. The authentic dark night is not depression, though it may trigger depressive episodes. It is not doubt, though it includes radical doubt. It is the collapse of the very framework within which questions of identity and meaning can be asked. The seeker stands at the edge of the abyss and recognizes that there is no solid ground anywhere, that every foundation is provisional, that existence itself is groundless. The philosophical tradition has long wrestled with this crisis. The existentialists made it central to their project. Kierkegaard's anxiety, Heidegger's being toward death, Sartre's nausea, Camus' absurd. These thinkers recognized that authentic existence requires passing through this crisis rather than avoiding it. The easy comforts of inherited meaning, of socially validated identity, of ideological certainty, all these must be surrendered. What remains when they are gone? For many, this moment precipitates collapse. The seeker retreats into cynicism, nihilism, or a desperate clinging to dogma, any port in the storm of meaninglessness. The project of identity reconstruction is abandoned, and the person settles for a diminished existence, going through the motions without authentic engagement. This is tragedy, but it is common. The crisis demands more courage than most can muster. But for those who can hold the tension, who can remain present to the void without fleeing into premature meaning-making, something remarkable occurs. The existential despair becomes the gateway to a different order of understanding. The Hermetic tradition encoded this in the maxim solvit coagula, dissolve and coagulate. The complete dissolution of meaning structures is the necessary precondition for the emergence of genuine meaning, meaning that is chosen rather than inherited, created rather than discovered. This is the crucial insight. Meaning is not found but made. Identity is not discovered but forged. The terror of groundlessness transforms into the freedom of radical responsibility. If there is no essential self dictating who one must be, then one is free to become. If there is no inherent meaning in existence, then one is free to create meaning through commitment, through action, through the exercise of will in service of chosen values. The philosopher Nietzsche understood this profoundly. His proclamation of the death of God was not celebration, but diagnosis, the recognition that the traditional sources of meaning and identity had lost their power to compel belief. His response was not despair, but the call to become the creator of values, to practice what he called self-overcoming, to forge identity through the disciplined application of will to the chaos of becoming. Yet there is a paradox here that Western philosophy struggles to articulate, but which the Hermetic tradition embraces. This freedom is simultaneously necessity. One does not choose to engage the process of self-creation. One is claimed by it. The crisis that initiates identity reconstruction is not selected like an item from a menu, but arrives as fate, as the manifestation of a developmental imperative deeper than conscious choice. Free will and determinism are revealed as two perspectives on the same phenomenon. The soul crisis also confronts the seeker with the reality of death, not merely physical death, but the death of every identity configuration, the impermanence of all constructed selves. This recognition can be paralyzing or liberating. If every self is temporary, why bother with the arduous work of reconstruction? The Hermetic answer is subtle. Precisely because it is temporary, because it is constructed, the self becomes a work of art rather than a natural fact. The transience of identity does not negate its significance, but intensifies it. The passage through existential crisis requires what the philosopher Gabriel Marcel called creative fidelity, a commitment to meaning-making even in the absence of metaphysical guarantees. This is not self-deception, but mature acknowledgement that meaning and identity exist at a different level of reality than facts and objects. They are not discovered through empirical investigation, but created through commitment and maintained through practice. In the depths of this crisis, many seekers report moments of unexpected grace, experiences of connection, insight, or peace that cannot be explained within the framework of psychological process or philosophical argument. Jung spoke of the transcendent function, an autonomous capacity of the psyche to generate symbols that reconcile opposites and point toward integration. Whether these experiences reflect contact with something genuinely transcendent or are emergent properties of complex psychological systems is ultimately irrelevant. Their function is the same. They provide the thread that guides the seeker out of the labyrinth of despair. The crisis resolves not through answers, but through transformation of the question itself. The seeker stops asking, "Who am I really?" and begins asking, "Who shall I become?" They stop seeking a fixed identity that will finally satisfy and begin participating consciously in the ongoing process of self-creation. The anxiety of groundlessness gives way to what the existentialists called authentic existence, living in full awareness of one's freedom and responsibility, creating meaning through committed engagement with the particular circumstances of one's life. The identity that emerges from the alchemical process is not a finished product, but a living system, dynamic and responsive while maintaining coherent integrity. The person who completes this work, or rather, who integrates this cycle of the work, for it is never truly complete, finds themselves changed in fundamental ways that casual observation might miss, but that transform the quality of lived experience. The most profound change is internal, a shift from identity based on external validation to identity grounded in self-knowledge and chosen values. The reconstructed self no longer depends on the approval of others for its sense of worth, though it may still desire such approval. It no longer derives its meaning from achievements or possessions, though it may still pursue these. The locus of value has shifted from outside to inside, from other to self, from given to chosen. This does not produce narcissism or solipsism. Paradoxically, the person who has successfully reconstructed their identity from internal foundations is more capable of authentic relationship, more genuinely available to others. They no longer need others to complete them, to validate them, to tell them who they are. This freedom from need creates space for genuine meeting, for relationship based on desire rather than dependency, on gift rather than transaction. The new identity possesses what might be called earned integrity, a coherence achieved through struggle rather than inherited through unreflective acceptance of cultural scripts. There is alignment between the multiple dimensions of self, between thought, feeling, and action, between private values and public behavior, between conscious intention and unconscious motivation. This alignment is never perfect. The unconscious continues to operate according to its own logic, but there is a quality of being at home in oneself that was absent before. Practically, this manifests as increased resilience, creativity, and capacity for purposeful action. The energy previously consumed by internal conflict, by the maintenance of false persona, by the suppression of unwanted aspects of self, becomes available for engagement with life. The person finds themselves capable of sustained effort toward meaningful goals, able to tolerate ambiguity and setback without fragmenting, responsive to changing circumstances without losing core direction. The Hermetic Tradition speaks of the philosopher's stone not as a substance, but as a state of being, the condition of one who has achieved the great work. This condition is characterized by what the medieval alchemists called the multiplication of virtue. Not moral virtue necessarily, but virtue in the older sense of power, capacity, effectiveness. The person who has integrated the work possesses increased capacity to effect change both in themselves and in the world. Yet there is also a quality of acceptance, even surrender. The reconstructed identity is comfortable with limitation, with mortality, with the fundamental uncertainty of existence. Having faced the void and chosen to create meaning in its face, the person no longer needs metaphysical certainty. They can act with commitment while holding their commitments lightly, engage fully while remaining non-attached to outcomes. This paradoxical combination, commitment without rigidity, action without attachment, purpose without compulsion, is the mark of mature identity. It reflects what the Buddhists call the middle way, and what the alchemists encoded in the symbol of the androgyne, the integration of masculine and feminine, active and receptive, will and surrender. The integration phase also brings what Jung called symbolic life, the capacity to engage with the world not merely at the literal level, but at the level of meaning and pattern. The person who has completed this work sees their life as narrative, as myth being enacted, as participation in archetypal processes. This does not mean escape into fantasy, but rather deepened engagement with the symbolic dimension of ordinary experience. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the reconstructed identity includes the capacity for continued transformation. The person recognizes that identity is not fixed, but fluid, not essence, but process. They have internalized the alchemical operations and can apply them to new challenges, new circumstances, new stages of life. The self becomes what the philosophers called autopoietic, self-creating, self-sustaining, capable of continual renewal. The goal is not perfection but wholeness, not the elimination of contradiction, but the integration of opposites, not the achievement of a final state, but the establishment of a creative relationship with the ongoing process of becoming. The reconstructed identity is simultaneously more solid and more flexible than what preceded it, grounded in self-knowledge yet responsive to growth, coherent yet complex, purposeful yet open to surprise. The ancient texts were never describing the transformation of base metals into gold. They were describing the transformation of the unexamined life into conscious existence, the alchemical truth hidden in plain sight. The gold you seek was never in the crucible. It is the will that tends the fire, the attention that watches the work, and the courage to continue when the vessel threatens to shatter.